The PC industry is walking out on Microsoft. Not one startup, not one tech blogger who switched operating systems in 2019 and never stopped talking about it. We are talking about millions of ordinary users, entire government ministries, national police forces, school districts, and IT departments all moving in the same direction, all at the same time. And the most embarrassing part? The thing they are all walking toward is the same free operating system that Bill Gates once called communism. That is not a metaphor. He literally said that. And right now, millions of people are choosing it over the product his company built. But here's the part that makes this so much bigger than another: is Linux ready for the desktop argument? Because the deeper you look at what Microsoft has actually been doing to its own users for the past 3 years, the more obvious it becomes that this moment was not a fluke. This was inevitable. And it gets worse before we get to the good part. Let's start with the number that breaks this whole story open. According to analyst firm Canalys, approximately 240 million PCs could not meet Windows 11's hardware requirements when Microsoft pulled the plug on Windows 10 support on the 14th of October, 2025. 240 million. That is a Canalys estimate, not an official Microsoft count. But even if the real number is half that, it is still the largest forced hardware obsolescence event in the history of personal computing. These were not broken computers. They were not slow computers. They were computers that ran Windows 10 perfectly fine, that people used every single day for work, for school, for gaming, for everything. And Microsoft looked at all of them and said, "Buy a new PC." The technical explanation is that Windows 11 requires TPM2, a trusted platform module chip, along with secure boot and specific processor generations, Intel 8th generation or later, AMD Ryzen 2000 or later. If your machine predates those, officially, it is done. And Microsoft's formal advice to users who could not upgrade was, genuinely, to purchase a new computer. Tell that to the school districts running computer labs on 2016 hardware. Tell that to the public libraries. Tell that to the millions of households where the family PC was bought in 2017 and runs just fine. Microsoft's answer was, buy a new one. The Free Software Foundation publicly called the TPM2 requirement a Microsoft-manufactured problem. That is a strong phrase from a credible organization, and it landed because it described exactly what users were experiencing. And that is where things started to shift. Because when you tell 240 million users to buy new hardware they do not need, some of them start asking a question Microsoft does not want them asking. What if I just stop using Windows at all? But the hardware wall was only the beginning of why people started asking that question. Because even if you had a machine that could run Windows 11, Microsoft was busy making the experience of using it feel like something you had to fight your way through. Start with the account requirement. When Windows 11 launched, Microsoft quietly removed the option to create a local account during setup on home editions. You had to connect to the internet. You had to create or sign into a Microsoft account. Tech-savvy users found workarounds. A command called bypass nro let people skip the requirement during setup and create a simple offline account the way they always had username, password, done. Microsoft patched it out. Then users found another method. Microsoft patched that out too. By early 2025, Microsoft had removed the bypass nro script from Windows 11 builds entirely. The official explanation was that these workarounds caused users to exit OOBE with a device that is not fully configured for use. That is Microsoft's language. But what it actually means, in plain terms, is this. Microsoft decided it knew better than you what your computer needs during setup, and it kept closing the exits until compliance was the only path forward. As of June 2026, users in forums are still reporting new bypass methods being blocked. It is a literal cat and mouse game between Microsoft and the people who paid for the product. Reddit communities have been full of the same story for months. Windows Central reported that people inside Microsoft are fighting to drop the forced account requirement entirely. That tells you everything. Even inside the company, engineers and product teams see this as a mistake, but the machine keeps rolling, and the users keep getting angrier. Here is the real plot twist with the account requirement, and it is bigger than a setup inconvenience. A Microsoft account does not just help you sign in. It ties your device to a cloud identity, to telemetry reporting, to Microsoft's advertising ID, to a commercial ecosystem built around making you a subscriber rather than an owner. Every forced account is a new node in Microsoft's data and services network, and every time a user bypasses it, that is a person who does not want to be that node. Linux installs differently. It asks for a username. It asks for a password. It does not ask for your email address. It does not push OneDrive. It does not attach your local file system to a cloud identity you did not choose. The difference is not just technical. It is philosophical. You bought the computer. Microsoft decided it needs your identity to let you use it. That is not a feature. That is a hostage situation. But the account issue is really just the visible surface of something bigger. Because once you have a Microsoft account and you are running Windows 11, the operating system has ideas about what it wants to do with your screen. In May 2024, Microsoft announced Windows Recall as the flagship AI feature of its new Copilot plus PC program. The concept was presented as a kind of photographic memory for your computer. Recall would take a screenshot of your desktop every few seconds, index everything using AI, and let you search your entire computing history with plain text queries. Sounds useful in a demo. The reality was something else. The initial version stored all of those screenshots in an unencrypted database. Security researchers almost immediately showed that the data was accessible to malware. Microsoft initially tried to ship Recall without even putting it through the Windows Insider testing program first. When the backlash hit, and it hit hard, Microsoft delayed the feature by nearly a year, overhauled the security model, and switched it to opt-in rather than the default. 1 year later, in April 2026, GeekWire was reporting that security researchers were still demonstrating ways to access the data Recall stores. The University of Pennsylvania's Office of Information Security issued a formal statement calling Recall's risks substantial and unacceptable and urged administrators to disable it. Signal, the encrypted messaging app, added a new screen security feature specifically to prevent its interface from being captured by Recall. The developers said plainly that software creators should not have to build workarounds to protect user privacy from the operating system itself. Now, to be clear about something important, Recall is not running on most Windows 11 machines. It requires Copilot plus PC hardware with a specific neural processing unit. Fewer than 10% of Windows 11 devices can even run the current version. The actual privacy risk is concentrated in a small hardware segment. But the damage is not really about the hardware count. The damage is about what the feature said about Microsoft's priorities. Build a surveillance tool first, secure it later, ship it as a flagship, and act surprised when users do not want their every banking session, private message, and medical search photographed and stored every few seconds by default. The Recall disaster led to something that should embarrass every executive who approved the original launch. Microsoft's Windows president Pavan Davuluri publicly acknowledged that the product went off track with its aggressive AI expansion. When does a company with a $3 trillion market cap admit publicly that its flagship operating system went off track? When users start leaving. That is when. And Recall was only the most dramatic example of the AI bloat problem. Microsoft was simultaneously cramming Copilot buttons into Notepad, into Paint, into File Explorer. Notepad. The app people open to paste a chunk of text without formatting. It now has a Copilot button. Users opened Paint to crop a screenshot and found AI suggestions waiting for them. They browsed their files in Explorer and found Copilot hints appearing. None of this was asked for. None of it added obvious daily value for ordinary users. And for months, when users pushed back in forums, on Reddit, on YouTube, Microsoft kept adding more of it rather than listening. The retreat came eventually. By early 2026, reports confirmed that Microsoft was pulling Copilot back from Notepad, Paint, and other apps. The company built a new group policy so IT administrators could remove the Copilot app from managed devices with a specific set of conditions attached. because even the removal came with friction. But the damage was done. The phrase that circulated in tech communities was AI fatigue. Users were not anti-technology. They were exhausted by being treated as a test subject inside their own operating system. Microsoft put AI in Notepad. Users put Linux on their hard drives. Someone blinked first. And while Microsoft was fighting its own users over AI features they never asked for, something else was quietly happening. Entire governments were doing the math. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein is in the middle of replacing 30,000 government computers with Linux and LibreOffice. By the end of 2025, they had migrated approximately 80% of those workplaces. The projected savings in license fees alone, over 15 million euros. That number is going to keep climbing, because Microsoft 365 prices are reported to be increasing by up to 16.7%, starting July 2026. When a German state government runs the numbers and decides that the cost of switching to Linux is lower than the cost of staying on Microsoft, that is not an ideological statement. That is a balance sheet. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs announced in summer 2025 that all of its employees would transition to Linux and LibreOffice. Copenhagen and Aarhus followed with their own announced plans. Denmark's digital minister, Caroline Stage Olsen, explained the decision in terms that resonated far beyond government IT. We must never make ourselves so dependent on so few that we can no longer act freely. That quote was aimed at vendor lock-in in the public sector. But it describes exactly what millions of home users feel every time Windows asks them to sign in, sync their settings, accept a Copilot suggestion, or update on Microsoft's schedule rather than their own. France's National Gendarmerie has been running a custom Ubuntu distribution called Genbuntu on over 103,000 computers for years. They did not wait for Windows to fail them. They made the decision strategically, and they stayed with it. The European Union now has a law, the Interoperable Europe Act, which took effect in 2024, that requires public sector bodies to consider open-source alternatives first before choosing proprietary software. The EU is even exploring a pan-European Linux distribution built on Fedora for government use across member states. And Microsoft's own lawyer, appearing before the French Senate in June 2025, admitted, under questioning, that he could not guarantee that French government data, stored on European Microsoft servers, was safe from access by the US government. That moment, that admission, accelerated conversations that had been happening quietly for years. Now, to be honest about the complexity here, government Linux migrations are genuinely hard. Munich, Germany is the cautionary tale. The city migrated to a Linux-based system in the early 2000s, declared it complete in 2013, and then reversed the decision in 2017 after persistent complaints from city workers about compatibility and workflow disruption. Munich started exploring a return to open source in 2020, but the history shows that migration at institutional scale is not a clean story. The current wave, Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark, the EU initiatives, is built on better tools, stronger political will, and much clearer economic pressure. But anyone who tells you government Linux migrations always succeed is not giving you the full picture. What is different today is the financial pressure and the sovereignty argument. Those are harder to argue away than software preferences. And here is something that gets overlooked in every year of the Linux desktop conversation: gaming. For decades, the single strongest argument for staying on Windows was that your games only ran on Windows. That argument is collapsing. Linux gaming on Steam reached approximately 3% to 3.2% of all Steam users by late 2025, the highest level since Steam for Linux launched. That represents a 52% increase year over year. The Steam Deck, Valve's Linux-based handheld, accounts for roughly 30% of all Linux gaming. Valve's Proton compatibility layer allows thousands of Windows games to run on Linux without any user effort. Lutris, the open gaming platform for Linux, welcomed 1.4 million new users in 2025. There are still games that do not work on Linux. particularly titles using anti-cheat systems that require kernel-level access on Windows. That is a real limitation, and gamers considering the switch should know it going in. But for a growing number of players, their entire library works. And when the library works, the last excuse for staying on Windows gets a lot smaller. Now let's talk about the numbers that make this whole thing concrete and impossible to dismiss. Zorin OS 18 is a Linux distribution made by a small company, the Zorin Group, founded by two brothers, Michael and Kamil Piech, in Ireland in 2008. It is designed to look and feel familiar to Windows users. A taskbar, a start menu, a desktop that does not require a manual. And it launched on the 14th of October, 2025, the exact day Windows 10 support ended. That timing was not a coincidence. In the 5 weeks after launch, Zorin OS 18 was downloaded 1 million times. According to the developer's own analytics, 78% of those downloads came from Windows machines. 1 month later, the total crossed 2 million downloads. After the release of Zorin OS 18.1, the total hit 3.3 million. Windows Central described the surge as one of Linux's biggest growth stories in years. Tech Republic and Tom's Hardware both covered it. Slashdot's coverage generated thousands of community comments from users, sharing how they had revived decade-old hardware by installing Zorin on a USB drive. Here is where the credibility matters. Downloads are not the same as permanent installations. Some of those 3.3 million downloads are people who tried it on a virtual machine and went back to Windows. Some downloaded it just to see what it looked like. The number represents curiosity and trial activity at an extraordinary scale, not a confirmed count of 3.3 million people who have permanently left Windows. But even framed as trials, the scale is unprecedented for a Linux distribution. And the fact that 78% of those downloads originated from Windows machines is not a number. Zorin Invented It is based on the referrer data from their own website. A trillion-dollar company abandoned 240 million users on a Tuesday. A free Irish startup picked them up. The global numbers back the trend. Linux desktop market share grew from 2.76% globally in 2022 to approximately 4.7% by 2025, roughly 70% growth in 3 years. In the United States specifically, Linux desktop share crossed 5% for the first time ever in June 2025, reaching 5.03% according to StatCounter data. The U.S. Digital Analytics Program, which tracks visits to over 5,000 federal government websites, reported that 6% of visitors were running Linux. It took Linux 2 decades to reach 1% desktop share. It took 3 years to nearly double. That acceleration is not random. It is a response. And here is the historical weight of that response. Because this is where the Bill Gates angle is not just clickbait. It is the real story. In 2005, Bill Gates called free software a new form of communism. That is a documented, on-record statement. His successor as CEO, Steve Ballmer, called Linux a cancer on intellectual property. Microsoft spent the better part of 2 decades fighting open-source suing companies over patents, lobbying against open standards, using its Windows monopoly to keep alternative operating systems off retailer shelves. The strategy worked. Windows won. At its peak, Windows held 95% or more of the desktop computing market. Linux was the thing for servers and hobbyists, and people who liked typing commands into terminals on a Friday night. And then something happened. Microsoft won so completely that it started treating its users like a captive audience rather than customers it needed to earn. It locked out 240 million working PCs, with a hardware requirement most users had never heard of. It made users fight through command line tricks to create a basic offline account. It photographed their screens every few seconds and called it a feature. It put AI in Notepad. It raised prices. Again. And in doing so, it gave the communism it spent decades fighting a population of users who had nowhere else to go and suddenly wanted to go there. Today, Microsoft owns GitHub, the largest open-source hosting platform in the world. Microsoft's Azure cloud runs primarily on Linux. Microsoft built the Windows subsystem for Linux so that developers could run Linux inside Windows without leaving the ecosystem. The company that called open source a cancer now depends on it for its most important products. And yet its own flagship desktop operating system is the thing driving millions of users toward the alternatives its founders once tried to destroy. Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, once said, "Microsoft was not evil, just incompetent." He was being deliberately understated. The reality is more complicated. A company can be strategically brilliant in the cloud, at enterprise software, at AI infrastructure, and simultaneously be terrible at listening to the people sitting in front of a Windows desktop every day. The users leaving right now are not leaving because Linux suddenly became perfect. They are leaving because Microsoft made staying feel too expensive, too controlled, and too exhausting. That is not a verdict on Linux. That is a verdict on Windows. And that is the real humiliation. Not that Linux is winning. Microsoft handed it the victory. The real question is not whether Linux is ready for you. It is more uncomfortable than that. The real question is why one of the most powerful technology companies on the planet, with every advantage, every resource, every integration, every piece of hardware ecosystem leverage available to it, made decisions that pushed people toward a free operating system built and maintained by a global community of volunteers and developers. Why did users need a two-person Irish startup to build the exit door? Why did governments need their own sovereignty concerns to justify switching away from software they had been paying for and trusting for 20 years? Why do users in 2026 still need to run a command in a terminal during setup just to skip a Microsoft account on a machine they paid for? Is Microsoft pushing too hard? Did it forget who actually owns the computer? Or did it simply decide that user control is a problem to be solved rather than a right to be protected? The download numbers have one answer. The government migrations have another. The gaming communities moving to Steam Deck and Proton have a third. And millions of ordinary users sitting in front of machines that Windows declared obsolete have the loudest answer of all. Let me know in the comments what you think, because based on what is happening right now, it looks like a lot of people have already made up their minds.